Welcome back. I want to talk a little bit about climate classification in general, and then we'll talk about different types of climates we find in the world. So this is a kind of a homemade, simplified climate map with different categories. We have tropical climates and dry climates and what we call mild or mesothermal climates and so on. And so what I want to talk about is the classification systems that we use in general, and then the different categories. So just to recap, climate is weather over time, that it is sort of the average of weather that we use to help understand how one place varies from another in terms of its general characteristics. And so by looking at, patterns of temperature and precipitation, we can generalize different regions of the world that share those characteristics that are generally the same temperature patterns or precipitation patterns. And the system that we use most often in geography is the Köppen or Köppen-Geiger classification system. Usually we just call it the Köppen one. And this is the most widely used system for classifying climates on a global basis. What's nice about it is it's based on temperature and precipitation records, and those are easy to get. And because they're easy to get, people record temperature and rainfall all around the world, that this is a classification system that is used worldwide. It's a global scale system. It has 5 major categories that are then broken into subcategories. And I just want to really kind of focus more on the major categories right now. The A climates here in purple near the equator are the tropical climates. And these are really limited to the areas near the equator that we call the tropics. The B, kind of shown here and over here, are the dry climates. These are grassland and desert climates. The C, kind of the darker green down here and a little bit up here in California, Western Europe, these are the mild mid-latitude climates. So these are wet, but not extremely cold. They are fairly mild in temperature. And the D climates, the ones up here in Russia and northern Canada and northern United States, are what we call severe mid-latitude. And these get really cold in the wintertime. And then the E climates up here in the North and South Pole, and also at high elevations, are what we call polar climates. Now, when it comes to areas of high elevation, like in the Himalayas, we have a special category called highland. And highland climates are really about climates that exist in mountainous landscapes, and they're defined more by the elevation levels. So at the different elevation levels, you have different changes in climate. So for example, Fresno and Shaver Lake are at the same latitude, but we have different climate types because Shaver Lake is at higher elevation. Here's a closer view of the classification system. We have A, B, they go by these letter codes: A for tropical, B for dry, C for mild latitude, D for severe, E for polar, H for highland. And one thing you should note is that different geography textbooks use different names for some of these, but they are consistent in the lettering code. So there's 5 primary categories, and then a 6th one, which is a special case, which is highland, what we use in mountainous landscapes. And each one of these can be divided into different subcategories with special characteristics. And we'll take a quick look at some of these subcategories as well. So just to recap a couple of things, we've talked about what affects temperature and precipitation. And we have sort of 3 different levels. We have latitude. Latitude, how far you are north or south of the equator, is a global scale pattern. And if you look at these climate categories, they generally run from the A categories at the equator up to the E categories near the poles. So from the tropical warm climates up to the extremely cold climates. However, it's not quite that simple, because let's actually just a moment. So we have the pattern of being hot at the equator and colder near the poles, but you also have alternating patterns of wet and dry environments because of the differences in high and low air pressure. Okay, the second thing that affects temperature and precipitation is position within a landmass. So where you are on a continent can play a role as well. So this is sort of a theoretical continent where we would start with the A climates and then the B and the C. But if we have a big enough of a landmass, we can also have this D category. And D are called continental climates because they are climates that you find on a large landmass. We also have differences between west coasts, where we have Mediterranean climates, and east coast, where we have a different type. So west coast, east coast plays a role as well. And then the third item at a local scale is elevation differences. And this is where highland climates come into play, that as you move up in elevation, it gets colder. And so you can have different types of environments at different elevations, even at the same latitude. So highland climates are kind of a mix of climate categories within a mountainous region. And it can also play a role in precipitation patterns because of the rain shadow effect. So this is a map. It's a little blurry of different Köppen climate categories in detail for the world, but we'll try to simplify that and break these down one by one. And one other thing to note is that when we classify climates, one tool that we use are climographs. Climographs are charts that show the change in temperature and precipitation over the course of the year. So just to introduce these, the red line here, this is sort of a simple homemade one, is the change in temperature from January, February, March, April, May through December. So here in this place, it's colder in January, it gets warmer into July and August, and gets cooler again back into December. The blue are the average monthly precipitation, how much rain it gets each month. And in this place, it is fairly low. We'll show a comparison in a moment, but it is fairly low, but decent amount of, some precipitation in January, February, March, but it really trails off into July and August, and then starts to pick back up again going into December. So this is a climograph for Fresno. And just to give you some context, this is the one we just saw for Fresno. And these are some other places in the world that are quite different. So this is in a tropical climate in Salvador, Brazil, where you have heavy amounts of rainfall year-round without a dry season, and a very consistent temperature throughout the year, because tropical locations don't have as much seasonality. This is what's called a monsoon climate in India, where here you don't have that much seasonal difference, and you have a heavy amount of rainfall during the summer months. This is in Santiago, Chile, and one thing that I'll highlight, if you compare that to Fresno, that the temperature patterns are quite the opposite, as are the precipitation patterns. So Santiago, Chile has a similar climate to California, but Santiago, Chile is in the southern hemisphere. So southern hemisphere locations are going to have an opposite pattern from northern hemisphere locations.